Government spending in macroeconomics. A macro video lesson with Steve Reff and Eric Almiroth.
Today we're going to look at the United States government federal budget.
So let's start with outlays, which is a nice way of saying government spending. In looking at this pie, what these sections represent are the main functions of government spending. And then we're going to be seeing how they relate to discretionary and mandatory spending, but also we're going to be looking at the sub-functions in each one of these main sections of the pie.
The largest discretionary policy on the federal budget is government spending on national defense. That's what's called the function. And then underneath, you notice military personnel, operation, maintenance, and so forth. Those are called sub-functions. These are what go inside of the budget for national defense. So when we're explaining these outlays, realize we're mostly going to be talking about the function, in this situation, national defense, and then we'll read through the sub-functions. And realize these figures are from 2004. But as far as a percentage of the pie, this doesn't change that drastically over time.
The numbers in terms of the amount spent may change somewhat significantly between now and then, but the percentage is not going to change that much.
Another discretionary spending is international affairs, which is the function, and then listed below
includes the sub-functions of international development, humanitarian assistance, international security assistance, conduct of foreign affairs, foreign information exchange activities, international financial programs.
The next discretionary spending is general science, space, and technology, which is the function. The sub-functions are general science and basic research, space flight research, and supporting activities.
And once again, we're reminding you these are discretionary expenditures we're looking at here. Next comes the main function of energy, which includes energy supply, energy conservation, emergency energy preparedness, energy information policy, and regulation as the sub-functions.
Notice that energy is in red, which means the Energy Department actually made money off of energy rather than being an outlay. And the actual government spending for energy was $1.3 billion. However, if you notice, the energy is a minus 166 million, which means they actually got a budget surplus for this spending because the actual spending for energy was 1.389 billion. However, in 2004, the loan repayments from the Rural Electricity and Telephone Loan Act of 1936 were repaid at 1.555 billion, and the difference then is 166 million.
So in 1992, Congress made repayments for these loans an on-budget item. A payment is a subtraction from an outlay or government spending. This is why this outlay is a negative 166 million.
Good way of explaining that, Eric.
Next, we have natural resources under government spending here, and the sub-functions of that are water resource conservation and land management, recreational resources, pollution control and abatement, and other natural resources. So natural resources in the environment was $30.725 billion in 2004.
Next comes agricultural spending, which is, again, a discretionary policy, which includes farm income stabilization or farm subsidies and agricultural research and services.
Commerce and housing. Credit includes mortgage credit, postal service, deposit insurance, other advancement of commerce. What do they mean by credit, Ref?
A credit is where it's a subtraction from income, where they go ahead and help people, especially at lower incomes, get some mortgage credit, which is a subtraction from their tax liability.
Housing credit was $5.273 billion in 2004.
Next comes transportation, which you've already seen in the news in 2021, talking about the physical infrastructure bill, looking at ground transportation, air transportation, water transportation, and other forms of transportation. And because our infrastructure has been getting older, we have to rebuild. And that's why you're hearing about it in 2021.
And how does government spending interface with air transportation? Aren't those private industry enterprises?
Anytime you're looking at the federal government Anything that crosses state lines, which is your ground transportation, air transportation, the federal government helps coordinate these efforts through government subsidies and also government outlays.
Next, we've got community and regional development, which includes community development area and regional development, disaster relief, and insurance. We're looking at some neighborhood homes there, but we're also seeing what can happen in the case of a flood disaster.
Yeah, so these are all the hurricanes, the tornadoes that hit, and you see the president come on television to go view these areas. This is where this money is outlaid for future damages of what might happen because of natural disaster. But also on the flip end, like you said, Eric, with the beautiful houses, it's also for regional and community development for the physical infrastructure inside those areas.
So then we have the major function of education, which includes elementary, secondary, and higher education research, and general education aids. The sub-functions under that would be training and equipment, other labor services, and social services. These are services that we've all been privy to, having experienced public education in this country at some point.
Yeah, where students are allowed to go to school for free, quote unquote, from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. You notice in 2004, $87.9 billion was spent on education at the federal level,
which is a small fraction of what is spent in total on education, based on the fact that most education is state funded.
State funding through property taxes helps fund public education, but also the federal government gives states extra support for higher education, secondary education, elementary education too. Health now is healthcare services, usually for the indigent, and health research and training.
Would you define indigent for our students?
These are people, because of sometimes fault of their own or through no fault of their own, are having a tough time making it in society.
Does that refer to people on disability?
Yes, that can include people on disability. This is the services they receive paid for by the government because of their financial or disability conditions. And you notice what a large number that is, and that's part of mandatory spending, because government by law has set aside monies every single year. So the people who are less fortunate, either because of financial situation, disabilities, and need, quote unquote, some help paying for the health bills that they might have.
Next then is Medicare, which includes Medicare Part A, which typically pays for your inpatient hospital expenses. There's also Medicare Part B, which typically covers your outpatient healthcare expenses, including doctor fees.
Now, Eric, are these expenses considered to be mandatory, or are they considered to be discretionary expenses by Congress?
These are mandatory expenses by Congress because people have paid into these, expecting that these services will be available for what they paid into.
Look at the size of that at $269 billion for Medicare expenses. Do you think that'll go up in the future as the baby boomers start to retire?
I'm planning on it.
But at least it was taken out of our paychecks.
That's true. This was a program like Social Security to safeguard our future.
Speaking about Social Security, look, now it's income security, which includes general retirement and disability insurance, not including Social Security, though. This is federal employee retirement, which is different than Social Security. Unemployment compensation for those who become unemployed. They get federal compensation check, housing assistance, food and nutrition assistance. A lot of this, again, goes to the people who are in the lower quintiles of income. This is to help them get a leg up. But don't forget, this money or these food stamps and so forth given out to these individuals help stimulate the economy. They're called transfer payments, a lot of them. So income security totals $332 billion in the year 2004.
Next is Social Security, which is a huge mandatory expenditure of Congress, which is about 25% of the entire budget, which is 6.2% taken out of paychecks, what we call payroll taxes. But we should also know you do not have to pay this tax beyond $142.8 thousand a year earning level. So if you're making $1 million a year, you're still only paying up to the earnings of $142.8 thousand.
Wow, that's interesting. 6.2% of everybody's paycheck up to 142,800. That money is collected, but don't forget, out of that money, you have retirees who receive money, and that's part of the outlays. This money is coming from people's pockets, plus what the government has to borrow.
So this is mandatory spending by Congress, considered mandatory because you're paying into this separate from your taxes that you're paying.
This is the expenditures to pay people who have enrolled and are signed up with Social Security Administration. Next comes veterans benefits, which includes income security for veterans, veterans education, training and rehab, hospital and Medicare for veterans. We have VA hospitals around the United States, veterans housing, and other veterans benefits. And the total for that is $59.7 billion in 2004. This is discretionary spending, as the students probably recall from our previous discussion on taxes. All your large expenditures are the mandatory expenditures other than national defense up at the top. Social Security took over national defense as the largest expenditure back in the late 90s.
It just seems to me, according to my normative opinion here, this was a fairly mandatory budget item. I can't imagine that Congress would choose not to honor that.
I think going forward, obviously they're going to honor it, but some rules will change. And when those rules change, they're making the decision to change the law of mandatory spending, such as these veterans benefits have changed since 2004 and have been on the upswing, have increased.
So that's why they would qualify as discretionary spending, because they can change these as these have been raised recently without having to have an act of Congress.
Right. And you notice it's outside of defense spending up at the top.
Next, we have administration of justice, which includes federal law enforcement activities, federal litigative and judicial activities, federal correctional and judicial activities, and criminal justice assistance.
You know what I'd like to point out here, Eric, before we look at the number there in 2004 is they say federal. We're not talking about state. We're not talking about county. We're not talking about city. They all have their judicial system. This is federal spending.
So this would include federal prisons.
Yes.
And also our court system on a federal level.
Federal law enforcement is different than having a city police officer, a sheriff. We're talking about federal law enforcement being federal marshals and so forth. So please, I hope all the students realize this budget we're looking at is federal government. Next is general government, which includes legislative functions, helping Congress both in the House and the Senate, executive direction, central fiscal operations. And when you look at the number for general government operations, the number is $21 billion. So this is really taking care of the operations of the federal government.
So we actually pay Congress?
Yeah, inside of there is salaries of all the workers there in Washington, D.C., and also at federal buildings throughout the country. It does create jobs. So at least that money will be respent in the economy. This is just to take care of government, just like businesses have to make sure they look at their outlays to take care of their companies, just like an individual has to take care of their outlays to take care of their personal finance.
I know, Ref, but regarding issues, what's the opposite of the word pro?
Con?
So then what is the opposite of the word progress?
Congress. Let's go on.
So the next we have net interest. Interest on the Treasury debt securities, the gross debt, interest received by on-budget trust fund, other interest, other investment income. And this is the one we talked about in an earlier video, which is the money that we are having to pay for the total debt we have taken on. So anytime we deficit spend, we increase the debt, and that also increases the interest on that debt. Our current interest rate on the debt incurred is 8% of our total budget, which is taking up a sizable portion of our entire expenditures pie at this point.
And if interest rates go up, then the net interest goes up. So there's outside factors that will cause this to go up or down. Usually, though, over the past few decades, it has gone up. And so what is that net interest on the debt total in 2004?
It was $160.2 billion.
And that's just the interest on the debt. And so if the debt gets larger because of deficit spending, what happens to the outlay of net interest then?
It's going to increase.
And then what happens if interest rates during the year go up, like they're currently going up?
Our net interest payments will increase again.
So then will that take up a bigger portion of that pie now?
Yes, increased interest rates definitely going to impact our net interest percentage of the budget.
Which means we might have to cut out some expenditures in these other areas that we've been talking about.
So which one do you recommend we toss?
Eric, that's up to Congress, and we'll let them debate that. The last one is just offsetting receipts, which is that you have to know something about accounting for us to go into this in depth, but we've given you what the offsetting receipts include. And so let's look at the total outlays in 2004 by the U.S. government. The U.S. government had total outlays of close to $2.3 trillion in 2004. And as we know, in 2021, this number is quite a bit larger than the $2.2 or $2.3 trillion you see here as total outlays in 2004.
So $2.29 trillion, big number. We should know that it's larger than that now. Hard to determine exactly based on all the things that are being proposed in Congress. But some estimates project our current year's expenditures in 2021 may be several times this amount. And we do know for certain in 2019, expenditures were a bit less than double 2004's expenditures at $4.4 trillion.
Yeah, as of today, November 2nd, 2021, I think you're really close to what that number has raised to from 2004. Going back to our earlier discussion, though, I think really this should put in perspective with the students that you have mandatory spending, which is, if you look at the budget on the left, is health, Medicare, income security, and Social Security, which is a large percentage that you could see in the pie graph. And that national defense, which is discretionary spending, is the largest portion of that type of spending. But remember that net interest sort of sits in between mandatory spending and discretionary spending, which takes up 8% of that pie.
Well done, Rep. Thanks for all the input.
Thanks. Enjoyed it. I hope the students learned a lot.
Government spending, a macroeconomics video lesson. The end.